So we continue with this jolly and light conversation with some talk of far right and its aesthetics. As you settle in, I'm just going to ask briefly, how many people here know what tradwives are, or who? Okay, a few. Yes. Fantastic. Cool. Just to know, well, that's for you, right? So I'm joined here by Dr. Eviane Leidig, researcher Archibald Gustin. Eviane is the Director of Research and Outreach at the Center for the Study of Organized Hate. She leads CSOH research strategy and partnership to combat organized hate, extremism, and online harms. She's the author of The Women of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalisation. Archibald is a postdoctoral researcher at the Vrije Universiteit, Brussels, and a lecturer at the University of Leidig. He's affiliated with the eco-research group Vrije, interdisciplinary research structure on gender equality and segregation. That's catchy. And the Institut de la Décision Politique. His research focuses in particular on the far right and its mainstreaming within contemporary European political systems. Thank you both for being here, first of all. Eviane, I'm going to start with you. After we've talked so much about men and men spaces, you have analyzed the role of women in radical movements in your latest book, The Women of the Far Right. Yeah, it's interesting to me because women are largely underrepresented, right, in this sort of spaces and this sort of language. Why focus on them?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think we've segued quite nicely from the previous panel to this one. So you're right in the sense that within the far right, it is a male-dominated space. And so when women are quite active, it's noticeable. So I started writing my book in 2019. And the reason why I decided to write this book was because at the time, so much focus was being paid to men in the so-called alt-right. So when people thought about the alt-right, they thought about notable figures like Richard Spencer, or maybe they thought about the Unite the Right rally with men wearing khakis, carrying torches. And I knew that women played a really integral role within the far right, and yet they weren't being taken, I would say, seriously, like in the media, even by other scholars. And so that's what motivated me to want to focus on women. And I found very quickly that women did not play a singular role within the far right. They play multiple roles, and that is as propagandists, fundraisers, messengers, you name it, right? And so I think that was the motivation for me for wanting to focus on women. Ever since I started writing that book, I would say that this scene, especially on social media, has dramatically shifted, right? So now when we think about womanosphere influencers, and I think womanosphere is an imperfect concept, but it is quite similar to the manosphere because there actually is like pretty broad networks of communities of female influencers who focus on like anti-feminist, anti-LGBTQ messaging, focus on traditionalism. I mean, that entire scene has exploded in the last few years.
And speaking of that, Archibald, you write a lot about anti-gender rhetoric. That's not necessarily the same as, the type of content or propaganda that we see online. How does that apply to what we see in Belgium specifically, and what is anti-gender rhetoric, first of all?
Yeah, very well spotted, because earlier we spoke about the manosphere, masculinism, about tradwives, anti-gender campaigns. Let's say they are another brand, like trend or stream of patriarchal politics, let's say. They first originated through the activism of the Catholic Church in the 90s, because back in the 90s there were important treaties, agreements negotiated at the level of the United Nations, and some feminist victories were obtained that in the agreement the words gender would appear and be used. And so the Catholic Church started opposing to this, started thinking about a strategy to oppose to this more progressive gender politics. Afterwards, it became more, let's say, not only the Catholic Church, but a lot of grassroots movements, political actors, such as far-right actors, but also like conservative right-wing parties, participate more broadly in those campaigns, which intensified heavily in the from the mid-2000s until the 2010 and now in the 2020. And sorry to insist about it, but it's really like something it's not the same as like anti-feminism, masculinism, or etc., etc. It's a specific kind of activism, mobilizations, politics, which is characterized by the fact that they regard gender, what they refer to gender, the infamous gender ideology, as the ideological metrics of a set of policies they oppose to in terms of sexual reproductive rights, gender mainstreaming, gender studies, sex educations, etc., etc. And so to answer back to your question, I was like, when I started my PhD, it was in the early 2020. And I grew up part of a generation which saw a lot of progressive movements emerging. Let's say Black Lives Matter, the climate marches here in Belgium was a huge thing back in the days. And then also this let's say new feminist wave after Me Too, and I was interested how do far-right parties, far-right actors cope with this emergence of new progressive movements in politics. Unfortunately, they coped better than I would have expected. Maybe I was a bit naive, probably.
They're doing quite well, actually, it turns out.
Yes, they did quite well. I don't know if I should go any further. Yes.
Thank you.
Should I?
Please finish.
Okay, yes. And so what I noticed is that in Belgium, in comparison to other countries which had seen the emergence of a strong anti-gender movement, in Belgium we didn't have such a strong movement as in Italy, as in Hungary, Poland, France, Spain, etc., etc. And so why is that so? Is because in Belgium we didn't have, like, the Catholic Church is not progressive, I wouldn't say that, but maybe more moderately conservative. Far-right and right-wing conservative actors were also more or less interested in taking part in such politics because they had, let's say, other priorities, like the Flemish far-right party, Vlaams Belang, was mostly interested and prioritized the struggle for Flemish independence or anti-immigration politics. So let's say that the usual suspects were not that interested or didn't see it as a priority or something they could benefit from. Last element that was very crucial here in Belgium is that most of the debate regarding gender equality were kind of settled, not definitely for sure, in the early 2000s. So it was kind of an early timing with respect to other states in Europe, for instance, which had seen, like, for instance, the legal acknowledgement of homosexual couple come way later. So for all those reasons, Belgium was stand a bit out as a particular case which had not seen this anti-gender stage coming in a very preeminent way.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting when you say, I was curious to know how far-right movements were coping then, and then to see how successful they are now. And part of their success is the aesthetics, right? They are nailing the aesthetics, and the aesthetics sometimes is the main message, right? As Eviane, you research online, especially when it comes to women, the political message is subdued from, lifestyle, wellness, family, content. We see a lot about motherhood and motherhood as this cultural performance. If you're a mother, then you have certain values, and therefore you're voting on the right. I'm interested in this. I want to talk more about the aesthetics. What did you think when you first bumped into it, and how important is it now?
So when it comes to aesthetics, that was the very first thing that struck me when I started researching this topic, was how so many of these influencers were using lifestyle content and in particular aesthetic frames, as a way to model what they saw as, I mean, the way I talk about it is the merging of like your political ideology with your personal lifestyle, right? And it became something that was about brand recognition. And I think this speaks off of what James was talking about earlier, right? It's about cultivating a brand, and often for these influencers, it's cementing this perception of authenticity, of being relatable, of being accessible, being responsive to their followers. And like, I think when I started writing about this topic, this is when this really started to become this massive social media trend. Because take, for example, tradwives. Yeah. So, I mean, tradwives have actually been around, I think, starting around 2015. It came out of the mommy blogging sphere. And actually, tradwives at that time were extremely political. They were quite connected to the Red Pill movement. They had kind of emerged at actually around the same time as what James was talking about.
Interesting.
However, over the last few years, we've seen tradwives evolve into the influencers that we commonly see on our social media feeds, right? Where instead of focusing on politics, they're choosing to focus on apolitical issues, yet still model through this coded imagery, what a traditional nuclear family should look like in terms of gendered roles for men and for women. And so, it is a strategic and a tactical decision to be able to model that lifestyle for their audiences. And I think what James was talking about, like there is a monetization opportunity here, which ironically, for many of the most famous tradwife influencers, they probably earn more money than their husbands do.
Mm-hmm. Just briefly, what does a tradwife do online? First of all, it stands for traditional wife. What sort of content? I'm thinking, for example, Nara Smith. Or what does that look like?
Yeah,
right?
Or Hannah Nealman of Ballerina Farm is another very popular tradwife influencer. So it's a lot of content that focuses on supposed day-to-day domestic labor activities, right? So it's about cooking all your meals from scratch, taking care of children if there are any in the household, being a submissive, obedient wife to your husband who goes out to work. And it's a lot of this very banal, mundane content, and I think this also goes back to what was discussed in the previous panels around like also using coded language or certain signals to indicate your ideological or political beliefs, but it's under the guise of what platforms would consider to be quote-unquote apolitical content, right? So it often is disguised under the surface.
And indeed, family, tradition, motherhood are all buzzwords that are key to the rebranding of the far right in Europe as well. Let's talk more about this rebranding and how useful it has been to get certain ideas to migrate into the mainstream.
Yeah, so you all know about probably all know about this infamous sentence, we cannot say anything anymore, and how liberal values such as freedom of speech are weaponized for reactionary Islamophobic purposes. Well, this is kind of a more general trend that we see with the far right, with the European far right, which is the kind of like rearticulation of liberal terms such as liberty, freedom, choice, rights in order to achieve the reactionary agenda. And if I give you the example of freedom of speech, is kind of an easy example that we kind of all know, unfortunately know. But even in the most reactionary traditionalist politics, the far right has managed to rearticulate such liberal signifiers with the reactionary policies. I give you two examples. The first is the defense of the opposition to abortion. So the opposition to abortion is per definition one of the most conservative, trademark, it's a very classical reactionary conservative policy they support. But in Belgium, for instance, Vlaams Belang has started to not claim to be willing to repeal the abortion law, but rather to defend the right of women not to abort. Mm-hmm. So instead of saying they are against abortion, they would say like, we are not going to touch the law allowing abortion, but what we want to do is make sure that every woman is able to abort and can actively make that choice, which means promoting easing the life of young mothers, etc., etc. So we see there is a kind of shift in which the most traditionally conservative proposals are reframed in a vocabulary which gravitates around liberal signifiers, choice, rights, etc. I give you another example. One of the oldest policies advocated by Vlaams Belang is the institutionalization of parental benefits. What is it is that they advocate that for any parents having a child from 0 to 12 years, parents would choose to stay at home to take care of the children, would benefit for a parental allowance. Of course, it's framed in very gender neutral terms. They say like each parent could benefit from it. But of course, if you look at statistics and if you know a bit about patriarchy and how that works, it will be mostly women that stay at home, have part-time jobs, etc., etc., etc. And what's interesting for your question is that it's once again framed in terms of choice. So they don't say like women should stay at home to take care of the children, to raise them, but rather they say we want to ensure that women and parents more broadly have the right, have the possibility, have the choice to make that decision. So that's the kind of dynamics we see.
Eviane, I saw you wanted to say something.
Yeah, well, it's quite striking because building on this argument of choice, or rather this discourse of choice, that is the same thing that we see amongst, these tradwife influencers, right? Because they always articulate it as, well, it is my choice to stay at home. And this is their anti-feminist argument, which is really just a superficial understanding of what feminism is, because feminism was never just about choice. It was more than that, right? But it's a really similar type of vocabulary that I'm seeing here.
Yeah, well, I think that what we mainly associate the far right with conservatism, reactionary politics in general, but what is less highlighted, I feel, is how the far right is able to build on more mainstream discourse, mainstream liberal feminist discourse of the, let's say, second wave, which were more like, yeah, but no, gender equality is more or less achieved. We are roughly equals, and now it's it's up to women to act for themselves, make this choice, to this choice, and it's very such a an depoliticization of feminist politics, of our women's emancipation that we see. That is not I don't think it's specific to the far right, but what I want to highlight here is that the far right managed to build on such mainstream and other discourses that are diffused, for instance, by tradwives, but also in more mainstream public sphere, and to build on it, to radicalize them, and to get the more radical politics to move more into the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. And when we look at the similarities, right, in discourse from what a tradwife in Minnesota is saying to what's happening here in Belgium, how do we justify the similarities? Do these movements talk to each other, and how do they talk to each other? Is it in online spaces? I'm interested in that.
So I think when we think about the transnational connections that are happening between, say, what's happening in North America and what's happening in Europe, it is important that we take a step back and think about, okay, what is the nature of those transnational connections? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's ideological, right? I think we're very clearly seeing that in this moment with the ascent of far-right political parties in Europe, as well as the Trump's MAGA agenda. Of course, there are some contextual differences there, but it's all based upon similar exclusionary, anti-democratic principles. At other times, we see these transnational connections happen, whether it's online through collabs on each other's channels, or it's meeting up in person at conferences, forums. I mean, there's been a very conservative and heavily funded effort to push for these types of transatlantic relations between far-right and conservative groups and networks. But, I mean, more or less, we're also starting to see, as Archibald had mentioned, a sort of merging of discourse and narratives as well when it comes to being able to diagnose and offer prognoses for various quote-unquote social ills and conditions.
Yep, and jumping on what Eviane just said, what I've been struck by during the time I studied those the far-right anti-gender wave was that how those people, like the far-right activists, are very well connected, and they like something that I was particularly interested in the new like extreme right-wing movement, Skillen and Vrienden, for those who know it, and I was fascinated to see, and also a bit worried to see how well they were connected to. For instance, they had pictures with Orban, with American conservative, religious conservative, and they're very like transnational. And it might be like, I don't know how, like something that also I find it very worried is to see how, for instance, the European Parliament is becoming such a platform for this transnationalization of this anti-gender movement, which was, let's say, the anti-gender campaigns were always transnational. It's more about like how the connection are built and maintained. It's not a surprise anymore when I see like that important anti-gender figures are invited to some event organized by one of the far-right groups in the European Parliament. A lot of things, unfortunately, happen here in Brussels, where we have a lot of like anti-gender networks that are really like anchored, embedded in the European political landscape. So that's, I think, is another way of how those ideology, the discourses are diffused within our societies.
Eviane?
Yeah, well, it's also important to recognize that many of these networks are heavily investing in young people, and they're investing in young people as their messengers and popularizing and normalizing these ideas to gather more mainstream appeal for their messaging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really important. As an Italian, I absolutely see that as a crucial part of, really building that grassroots support from a very young age.
Or I would say the perception of a grassroots support at times.
I wanted to talk more about the relationship between conservatives and far-right. So is it that conservatives are talking like the far-right, or that the far-right is just having more space? Like, how do you analyze? Are both phenomena happening at the same time?
That's an excellent question. And actually, I think the first thing to say here is that maybe the border between like right-wing conservative of the mainstream right-wing parties and the far right is sometimes a bit overstated. Mm-hmm. Not to say that they are too like 100% equal, but if we see the actual politics that some conservative right-wing parties advocate for or promote or implement, you can legitimately ask and wonder what's the difference. And there are many reasons of why these similarities exist. If you look at the far-right political landscape in Belgium, for instance, you can see how, especially through the Flemish movement, the Flemish Nationalist Party, conservative right-wing, which is currently leading the federal government, the Flemish government, the N-VA, they are really, really embedded in Flemish nationalist network here in Flanders. That means that basically leaderships from both the N-VA and the Vlaams Belang go to the same student association, for instance. They go to the same like circles. They are very socialized in the same way, and it's maybe like less of a degree of a difference in terms of like it's less of a qualitative a difference than a quantitative, like how much to the right are you, Another reason why, so this is the first reason I would say. The second is that it's about the first reason linked to socialization of elites, let's say. I think the second reason why we see those similarities emerge, maybe, is because of the competition on the right and the belief that if you don't occupy this space on the most right, the further right of the political spectrum, then you will lose voters, and you will lose your constituency, right? Your electoral support. Well, in fact, a lot of studies have shown that this strategy is not working. So if you look at how this is the usual justification for adopting reactionary views and position, is to say that if you don't do that, support would go for the far right. But this is what eventually always happened, basically.
The fall of the so-called cordon sanitaire, right? We've seen that in Brussels happening.
Exactly. And if you see, sorry to bring that back to the Belgian politics once again, but if you look at what happened to the NVA, they were in government in 2014, 2018, and they decided to leave the government because of, they pretended to have an issue with an international agreement regarding migration, the United Nations Pact for Migration. And so they campaigned, they did a whole 2019 campaign around the issue of migration, which obviously paved the way for a far-right victory back in 2019. Instead, in 2024, I don't know if they learned from the mistake, or did they took some inspiration from the situation in the Dutch politics, when the Liberal Party had heavily campaigns as well on immigration and suffered from a dramatic loss at the elections. Instead, in 2024, the NVA made a totally different campaign, focusing heavily on budget, financial, fiscal issues, like let's fix the budget, something like this. And they purposefully try to avoid to play on the ground where that was the most fertile for the far right, and against all expectations, they managed to stay. They remained the first party in Flanders and in Belgium. So I just give this example to say that when you don't play the game of the far right, you actually still win. You don't need to play the game to win. That would be my.
Thank you.
And I think you've made a really compelling argument there in terms of how much the center-right has been absorbed into the far-right's agenda. I would also add, we should be cautious about the center-left also falling into the far-right's agenda as well, simply because, they might be scared of losing their voters to the far-right or so forth. And I think we've seen examples of this when it comes to migration, for example, right? The center-left taking much more of a conservative stance on migration policies in order to potentially appease far-right voters. So that's just another area of caution that I would flag.
And I'm curious, do you think that the same way politicians are afraid of voters going more, towards more polarized spaces, do you think the same happens online, and that's why we see the radicalization of influencers as well?
Could you clarify your question?
The same way that we see politicians adopting more and more extreme views in order not to lose their public, do you think that happens online, or do you think there's different dynamics going on there?
There's a lot of dynamics going on there, right? I know the next couple of panels are going to be focusing on content moderation and regulatory frameworks, so I won't go into too much of that detail, except that I think we all know that in these online attention economies, we are at a point where I hesitate to use the word algorithmic radicalization because I don't think it's so simple as some kind of technological determinism that's happening. I mean, there is definitely a socio-technological component in which, I also don't believe necessarily in this rabbit hole metaphor anymore, because as soon as you log on to a platform, you don't have to fall into a rabbit hole. That content is being surfaced to you. There was a really interesting study done by DCU where they looked at, they created fake accounts based on profiles of 16-year-old boys Some accounts were purposefully seeking out manosphere content, some were not, and they found that regardless of the profile being created, these accounts were being served manosphere content within 23 minutes.
Wow.
Right, so it's not like you have to actively go search out this type of problematic content. It's being directly surfaced to you, and it's being algorithmically amplified because we know that it is a profit-generating business model which is trying to constantly seek your attention on these platforms. So, I mean, going back to your question, though, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily so simple in terms of what how influencers are perceiving their viewership. Or what users might be organically looking for. I mean, I think something that kind of bothers me is oftentimes people talk about the fact that my algorithm knows me so well, right? As if individuals have ownership over an algorithm, right? Like we are of course being micro-targeted based upon certain projected demographic characteristics and so forth, right? So I don't for those who raised their hands when they knew what a tradwife was, I can guess that we probably have very similar backgrounds, right? And that's not a coincidence when it comes to the fact that we might be looking at the same type of content being recommended to us on these platforms. And so that is something that often influencers, know about, or maybe they intuitively think they know about, right? So they're obviously trying to cater content along those lines. When I talked about the growth of the womanosphere, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that there was this saturation of different tradwife influencers within a couple of years. They were all kind of jumping on the trend when it came to trying to assess the popularity of that content. So I think, it depends a bit on the influencer, what their motivation is for wanting to create content. And it is a saturated market, so they're always trying to create their own niche on these platforms, right? How can I create my own unique selling point, my own brand that keeps my audience engaged? And just a very brief example, one influencer that I researched for my book, over the period of 5 years, I saw how she was kind of changing the type of content that she was posting. So over time, she really started off in the red pill space. Then during COVID, started latching on to QAnon and conspiracy theories. Then she became an Orthodox Christian, and then a doula and a midwife, right? And I could see that she was kind of testing out these different topics to see what would land with her audience, where could she grow her impact and get the most views for her content. So these influencers are constantly trying to find ways to refresh themselves, because the truth is, users get bored and they just scroll on to the next influencer or content creator.
I think you've touched upon something really important that we haven't really had the time to talk about, and I just want to be brief because I know we don't have too much time, but it's the phenomenon of crank magnetism, or better, how these spaces attract different conspiracies, and you might go in because you believe in something, and then you're fed all these different reasons why everything else that you believe is false. How much does that play within the phenomenon of women in the far right, and how did you experience that online?
How was my experience?
Yes, as in what type of conspiracies are in the spaces? What were you fed? Maybe I'm more interested in your personal experience with that.
So it's interesting because as I was writing my book, I was going through different life stages in the same way that these influencers were as well. And I think at certain times, and this is quite a personal note, at certain times I found myself starting to resonate with some of their messaging. And I would consider myself an expert who can very easily spot the signs of radicalization, but I was writing this book during lockdown, during COVID. I was quite isolated, and I was spending hours on YouTube and Instagram, which I do not recommend. But yeah, I mean, I think this messaging started to relate to me. However, I had to take a step back and realize it was a lot based on my positionality, right? as a white passing cis woman, a lot of the topics and narratives that were being projected towards me were things that I could relate to, but maybe in ways that others could not, right? So it was important for me to take a step back and sort of understand why this was having such a powerful effect on me in that sense. But in terms of the topics, it was a really broad range of different lifestyle issues. Everything from messaging against hormonal birth control to like pregnancy and motherhood to cooking. I actually learned some really good cooking recipes, which I don't like to admit, but I mean, cooking, skincare and beauty, alternative health and wellness advice, like very broad array of different lifestyle choices, which I think is what we see in terms of similarities with the manosphere, right? Focus on diet, fitness, finance, self-improvement. These types of topics are also trying to appeal to women as well. And I think that's why we're seeing really interesting overlaps when it comes to reactionary masculinity and reactionary femininity spaces.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to add something?
No, I was just thinking that I should ask you for the recipe.
I also want that. We'll talk about it later. When rhetoric comes from internet influencers, this sort of personas, we talk about content moderation and everything related to tech policy, which the wonderful Elisa Gracie would touch upon later. But when this sort of rhetoric and violent language comes from elected politicians, what does accountability really look like?
Yeah, I will give you a quite simple answer, but I do believe in Belgium we have a lot of debate around the cordon sanitaire, so the fact that we exclude the far right to take part in any kind of executive coalition. In French-speaking Belgium, we also have like the same system at the media level. So in Belgium, the far right is not, in French-speaking Belgium, the far right is not platformed, let's say, in public broadcast, on television, etc., etc. And I think that it's important to once again repeat that this has the cordon sanitaire has always been beneficial to the fight against the diffusion of reactionary discourses and ideas. Maybe it does have some limits, of course, and we see that with the social networks, and the platforming of reactionary content on social networks. But I think that this remains the best way to fight against the spread of reactionary ideas and discourses. Something I would like to add is that I think that when talking about the far right and thinking about strategies against the far right, we are always quite reactive. So that is that we are always like, how can we fight back, if you want, but we never take the lead in some sort of way. So I was thinking about what could I say now when I'm saying about like we should try to defend the cordon sanitaire, but I think that we should go a step further by thinking about how we could improve it, and it might be, I don't know if it's a very applicable idea, but what I was thinking is that we should try to implement some kind of system in which to make it a bit more flexible in its use. I mean that right now in French-speaking Belgium you can go on public television if you are a member of a far right party. However, if you do take a very reactionary or far right positions, but you are not part of a far right party, let's say you are like even a left-wing politician, and you say some, I don't know, very offensive speech on television, you are still accepted and regarded as a mainstream politician and therefore accepted on public television. Instead, what I would suggest is that we think about ways to make this cordon sanitaire, to find a way for the cordon sanitaire to also target racist, sexist, transphobic speeches that are adopted by non-far right politicians. Yeah, I don't have any idea of how to implement this concretely, but I think that maybe this is something we could think about together. But I think that this would be a way to hold people accountable.
Eviane?
Yeah, and I think specifically when it comes to social media, particularly for politicians or other public figures, you don't need to give them a verified badge, because we know that verified figures tend to have a lot more reach on these platforms. And as was mentioned earlier, these platforms are not neutral. They are profit generating, and they're based on sensationalist and outrageous cycles of virality. And that is something to bear in mind when it comes to these figures as well, because freedom of speech does not mean freedom of reach. There are certain affordances that are being provided to them on these platforms that we need to hold, these private corporations accountable for.
I quite like that. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom of reach. That's good. I'm gonna now ask the public if there's any questions there. Yes, Tamina?
Thanks so much for your talks. I wanted to ask about influencers' role here and how they sort of appeal to, I'm assuming, younger girls. So is it sort of implicitly done? Is it that they're attracted to their skincare routine and then they go and like that person? Or is it that they're actually looking for that kind of content and find these people?
It could be both, honestly. I mean, there's been some really interesting studies looking into different types of lifestyle genres and communities on platforms, and very quickly, even when it comes to, say, skincare and beauty blogging, all of a sudden there'll be recommendations for more sort of extreme content. So on the other hand, we also see how these influencers are strategically tapping into these lifestyle trends as a means to also reach audiences and get their messaging across. And sometimes it's very insidious, other times it's a bit more explicit. It also kind of depends on the platform and the medium. For example, I found that, so when I was writing my book, Instagram started to become a lot more popular as a sort of radicalization arbiter. And when it came to just their posts on Instagram, it was still tended to be rather banal content, but then I started noticing on their stories was when they started posting a lot more extreme white supremacist content, right? And they knew that was because that content was going to disappear after 24 hours, and so users are much less likely to report that type of content to the platform. But also posting a story opened up opportunities for DMs from users, so they could funnel that one-on-one communication with their followers. So I think it just depends a bit on the form as well as the type of content being posted.
We're gonna take one more. Yes. Very short, they tell me.
Okay. No, I was curious. First of all, thank you very much, because it's a topic that really, it's interesting. If you associate the phenomenon of tradwives to other forms of kind of so-called feminist cult, but they were born for profit, I'm referring, if you followed all these issue of this kind of cult that use childbirth, natural childbirth, to basically make money out of people, of women, using, of course, very sensitive topics, exposing them to, very unhealthy practices. And I'm talking because in that case, they really isolated them from their community, and is not very much connected to far-right or whiteness. But in the end, it showed how these people actually believed only in these kind of weird personas that could basically tell them everything, going also, also this role very much, fixed of what men and women should be. Do you think has any connection, and, basically how we can respond to this fact that they are growing this movement of exclusionary so-called feminist movements? I'm also talking about, what's happening in France with this nemesis movement. What's your stand with that? Because it's something that is growing.
Just maybe a context around what happened. You mean the the murder of a far-right activist, but...
Of course, because that's connected, but the emergence of these kind of so-called feminists that are not feminists,
femcells, yes.
But they exploit to get some sort of gain.
So was your question specifically around that kind of exploitation of feminist language, or yeah? For yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that also goes back to fundamentally what we were discussing earlier around the discourse of choice as well, and like proclaiming, like there's some far-right female figures who say like, well, we're the true feminists, right? Let's take that aside for a minute, right? But, you know, that is, they're trying to, I think in many ways, redefine what like a conservative woman looks like, and part of that exercise is also trying to hijack very neoliberalized concepts around feminism to sort of suit their own agendas and so forth. But also some of that content could be targeting male viewers as well. So like when I was doing my research, I assumed that most of these female influencers were trying to target and radicalize other women into the movement, but it really depended on the platform. On TikTok, for example, they had far more male viewers than Instagram, right? So they're deliberately leveraging these different affordances and different types of consumers on these platforms to fit and tailor their messaging for their target audiences.
Thank you both for your insight, for engaging in this conversation and difficult questions about power and online spaces. Thank you, everybody, for your attention span. This is impressive.